Welcome to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies.
The Turin Shroud, investigating the mystery of Christ's burial cloth. Rosalyn Kendrick. Rosalyn Kendrick is the author of Does God Have a Body? And was head of religious studies at Bilton Grange High School, Hull. This episode first appeared as an article in the December 2005 edition of the Christian Parapsychologist journal, and may reflect the language and attitudes of the time in which it was written. Responsibility for opinions expressed herein rests solely with the author, and such opinions must not be taken to represent those of the CFPSS. Anyone attempting to keep abreast of shroud studies would find it hard to do better than to read Face to Face with the Turin Shroud, edited by Peter Jennings. This is a concise book of essays by 6 distinguished contributors, including the General Secretary of the British Society of the Turin Shroud, the Reverend David Socks, the Right Reverend J. A. T. Robinson, and the Home Office pathologist, Professor J. Malcolm Cameron. It gives such an excellent progress report that one might well think it as valuable as 6 separate books, and the comments I give below by no means do justice to the work of the contributors. It also includes a foreword by Magnus Magnusson, in which he neatly sums up the problems. How do we account for the shroud's history before the 14th century? Why cannot science produce definitive answers to the mystery? If it is a forgery, why has no one yet been able to show how it was done? Professor Philip McNair of Birmingham University opens by asking how we can know that it is not a fake. It must be admitted that the shroud made its historical debut in highly equivocal circumstances, halfway through a century notorious for devout chicanery and pious relic-mongering. Before the end of the 14th century, it was already condemned as false, and Bishop Pierre Darcy actually produced an artist who claimed to have faked it. However, in its favour, McNair points out that it is made of Gossypium herbaceum, a cotton fibre cultivated in the Middle East, which was not in use in Europe in the period of the possible faking of this cloth. By Jewish law, Leviticus 9:19, the blending of cotton fibre with wool was expressly forbidden, and the presence of even one wool thread in the cloth would have excluded it from being a Jewish burial shroud. Analysis reveals that there is a total absence of wool in its composition, not one thread of it. Therefore it is highly unlikely that it is a medieval cloth. The pollen analysis vouches for its origin in the Middle East and a possible period of residence in Turkey. McNair introduces the interesting question of the relationship of our shroud to the one which was preserved in Besançon Cathedral until a fire in 1349. The Catholic Truth Society pamphlet, by Langton Fox, suggests it was looted from Besançon and given to Philip VI, and that it passed from him to Geoffroy de Charny, and is in fact the shroud we are now considering. Dr. Pierre Babet's book, The Passion of Our Lord Jesus Christ, gives interesting information on this question, and is still one of the classics in shroud study. According to Byzantine historians, and Dom Chamard in particular, a shroud was deposited in the hands of the Archbishop of Besançon by one Ponce de la Roche, a seigneur from Franche-Comté, and the father of Othon de la Roche, who was one of the chief leaders of the Burgundian army in the Crusade of 1204. This shroud was venerated in the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne until 1349, when the cathedral was laid waste by a terrible fire, and the shroud disappeared. Only its reliquary was found. It appeared that it had been stolen. In 1357, it reappeared in the possession of Geoffroy de Charny, having been given to him by King Philip VI. He must have received it from the robber, who is believed to have been one Vergy, a relative of Geoffroy's wife. Charny deposited it in the collegiate establishment at Léry in the Diocese of Troyes, which he had founded a few years previously. Now, at about the same time, another shroud reappeared at Besançon, along with several other false avatars in the following century, which was clearly a poor and incomplete painted reproduction of the one at Léry. The representatives of the Committee of Public Safety proved this to their satisfaction in 1794, and it was destroyed with the consent of the cathedral clergy. The shroud at Léry was meanwhile the object of the hostility of the bishops of Troyes, first of all Henry of Poitiers, and 30 years later Pierre d'Arcis, both of whom objected to the expositions put on by the canons of Uri, presumably because the crowds were deserting their own relics at Troyes. The Charnys took back the relic, and in 1389 they presented their cause to the new Avignon Pope, Clement VII. Clement was related to the second husband of Jeanne de Vergy, Geoffroy's widow. He authorized the exposition, but later decided that a declaration should be made that it was a painting. Darcy claimed that his predecessor had received the admission of the artist who had painted it. But no traces were ever found of this supposed inquiry, or the avowals made. If there ever was a painter, it is far more likely that he was the one who copied the Léry shroud to make the one at Besançon after the relic had left the cathedral during the fire. Marguerite de Charny took the shroud to Belgium, and in 1452 made a present of it to Anne de Lusignan, the wife of the Duke of Savoy, and its history is known from this time on. Apparently, even at that time it was subjected to certain tests, for Anthony de Lalaing stated that it was washed and even boiled in oil. Presumably the modern tests would reveal the truth or otherwise of Lalaing claims. Professor Cameron's involvement in shroud studies is a particular delight to me, as published opinions have varied sharply as to whether the shroud's contents were a living or a dead person. Cameron reports that the image is consistent with that of a crucified body in a state of post-mortem rigour, in the position into which the body would slip after death. For the blood marks, he suggests that the blood may have clotted on the skin and been transferred to the cloth, and then undergone a process of fibrinolysis, a breaking down into numerous components by enzymatic and bacterial action, and then being absorbed by the linen. Cameron thinks that the face reveals various injuries consistent with the biblical hints of the beating that Jesus received, and that the eyes appear to be closed and sunken, suggesting again the changes that take place after death. He sees no indication of the placement of metallic coins on the eyes, which others have suggested. He also feels that the arms had been bent forcibly across the abdomen to break the rigour of the shoulder girdle, a not unusual problem when dealing with death from any cause, in order to get the body into a straight position for burial. Again, the fingers seem to be somewhat shriveled, which could indicate either blood deprivation or post-mortem change. His findings seem to be consistent with the observations of Dr. Babet on the sufferings that Jesus was obliged to undergo. Professor Cameron's credentials are beyond question, unlike the unnamed experts in certain books on the shroud, who are convinced that Jesus did not die at all upon the cross. I must admit that I found some of these books quite convincing until I looked very closely at the text. For example, Inquest on Jesus Christ by John Reben seemed to present some very serious objections to the theories of Dr. Babet, and Reben's criticisms were presumably picked up by Rodney Hoare in the Testimony of the Shroud. Reben's book, published in English in 1965, claims to be by one who is the world's foremost authority on the Holy Shroud, and includes many of the opinions of one Kurt Berner, a writer since 1950, a member of the Roman Catholic Church, and secretary for the German Convention for the Shroud. A reading of David Socks's contribution in Face to Face drew my attention to the fact that there is something about the names of John Raman, Kurt Berner, and Hans Naber that should not escape the notice of any average crossword addict. They are one and the same person. Given this clue, one can then read with great interest the conversations and opinions of Berner that Raman kindly published for him. The main outlines of his theory, which one can still consider seriously, however, is that Scripture did not foretell that the Messiah would die. Quite the opposite, in fact. It is vital that the shroud should be proved to be genuine, for it gives convincing evidence, says Berner, that Jesus did not die, and therefore Christians are mistaken in their belief, and the Jews may safely accept that Jesus really was the Messiah. He claims that a great number of communications from medical experts have referred to his evidence as correct and valid, although the bulk of his book is concerned with answering back the criticisms made by other named persons, including the suggestion that he had tampered with Henry's photos to prove his point, an accusation which he did not deny. He also accuses Dr. Babet of a regrettable lapse, which has misled all those who innocently rely on his findings, without stating what the supposed lapse is. However, a German Jewish journalist coincidentally meets one of these unnamed experts. Raman explains that Professor Hurt is only the pseudonym of someone who does not want to take the personal credit for his discoveries about the shroud, and is converted immediately to belief in Jesus as the Messiah as a result of his findings. I could not help wondering whether this Jewish journalist was not the real clue to the identity of Berner, Raman, etc. As if all this were not enough, the book also includes a very interesting description of a vision of a German nun in 1820, which sounds genuine enough. David Socks identifies her as Anne Emmerich, born 1774. But its great coup must be an extraordinary message from Jesus given to yet another unnamed person in 1947 that miraculously backs up Raman's theories. Ian Wilcox, however, revealed in his book Shroud that when Berner heard he was researching, he visited him, and during their conversation announced that this particular unnamed person was himself. David Socks, whose own book, File on the Shroud, was published by Hodder and Stoughton in April 1979 and is both excellent and informative, reinforced my gradually developing opinions of Raman when he revealed the part he played with the newsmen and public media when the shroud first became an object of public debate. Berner's contention was that the Church was about to destroy the shroud because it held the evidence that Christ had not died on the cross, in order to perpetrate their fraudulent deception of the faithful. This naturally caused a sensation, offended the Church, and made them very wary in their dealings with publicity and investigators. The chary attitude of the authorities concerned has not helped genuine seekers after the truth to find the answers they desire as quickly as they would have liked. David Socks gives a very revealing outline of the problem of the ownership of the shroud and the changing attitudes of its guardians, including ex-King Umberto of Savoy. One of the Society's main aims is to see a successful carbon-14 test done on a shroud sample. Between 1950 and 1976, the amount of material needed for C14 dating has decreased from 40 grams to about 60 milligrams. David Socks decided to locate the two pieces cut off in the 1973 tests to see if they were suitable for use. They turned up, still with Professor Reyes, the pollen expert in Ghent. Dr. Macrone, the microanalyst, and David Socks saw them in Professor Reyes' flat on 19th of September 1976. Dr. Macrone thought they were suitable for testing, but Professor Reyes had been in touch with another C14 specialist, Professor D. Apers, who disagreed with Dr. Macrone. Professor Reyes then wrote to Turin for permission to test, and they asked for the recall of the samples. He sent them back by post. In 1977, the custodian denied that the pieces had ever been cut from the relic. Late in 1977, Cardinal Pellegrini retired from the guardianship, and new moves were afoot to get the C14 tests agreed to. A Monsignor Ricci had approached ex-King Umberto and phoned through to the custodian that permission for the tests had been granted. He also obtained samples from El Santo Sudario of Oviedo Cathedral in Spain, a stained piece of linen possibly used as a pillow. Dr. Macrone prepared tests, but the Bishop of Oviedo demanded the return of the relic before they could be done. After reading Bishop Robinson's contribution in Face to Face, I personally would like to know whether this relic could be the jaw band he mentions. In the 1978 exposition, all the proposed tests were agreed to, except the C14 dating. David Socks revealed in a letter to me that such are the wonders of modern computer techniques, we shall have to wait until 1980 for the full results. We wait with bated breath, for they are certain to be most exciting. Dr. Stuart Fleming, of the University Museum, Philadelphia, suggests Raman spectroscopy, a test capable of identifying any organic or inorganic molecules. This would provide an interesting answer to the question raised by Paul Vignon, in his book The Shroud of Christ, of the reaction of the urea in Christ's death sweat with the chemical aloetin in the aloes with which his body was surrounded. Apparently, a reaction can take place which would result in a kind of photographic negative being made of the material of the shroud. This theory has already been criticized by Dr. Babet, who admitted that fibrin would certainly dissolve in a solution of ammonia, but found no signs of ammonia in the urea on the shroud. There is certainly a little urea left by the sweat drying on the skin, and there is also some in the blood and lymph exuded by wounds, but in no case did Dr. Babet think the amount would be considerable. In any case, he stated that it had none of the properties of ammonia. It would need to be transformed into carbamate and then into carbonate of ammonia, and this transformation takes some time. The presence of a special microorganism, the Micrococcus ureae, would also be needed, and there is no reason why this should have existed on the surface of Christ's body. Babet's friend Dr. Volkringer, the chief apothecary in the Hospital San Josefe, placed some urea experimentally on the skin of an animal, and the ammonia vapour did not appear for 20 hours. He pointed out that in any case the reaction would be delayed by any antiseptics, such as aloes. The two necessary conditions for the formation of ammonia, time and ferment, are absent when considering the shroud, so Babet remains sceptical about the theory. However, within the past year, an ultra-microanalytical form of spectroscopy has been developed capable of handling extremely minute samples. If the structure of the shroud's linen incorporates any dye stuff, any ammonia-based molecular configuration, any byproduct produced by heat, or any elements from spices like aloes, Raman spectroscopy would find it. It has a sensitivity about 1,000 times greater than methods used in 1973. I'm afraid do not know if Dr. Fleming's suggestion was made in time to be included in the present experiments. Dr. Volkringer, incidentally, was the person who produced the extraordinary pictures of leaves. He knew that leaves in old herbals, dried between two sheets of paper, sometimes left an image. When he photographed these impressions, he found out that on the plate reversal had taken place, as on the shroud photographs, and he had a positive image of the plant. What was most exciting was that this positive image showed the plant as it had been when first placed between the sheets of paper, and not the dried-out corpse it now was. He also assumed that the images took time to appear, as herbals only 30 years old had scarcely any markings, but in much older ones they showed quite clearly. The final contributors in Face to Face are the Right Reverend J.A.T. Robinson and Dom Albrick Stackpool OSB. Dr. Robinson's contribution is to try to harmonise the existence of the Shroud with the New Testament narratives. It is particularly fascinating because it reveals the path by which Dr. Robinson has come to accept the Shroud, given our present state of knowledge about it. His analysis of NT linguistics is most helpful, and also his background into the chronology of the events of Christ's burial. An interesting detail is his suggestion that the face napkin mentioned in St. John's Gospel may have been a cloth tied under Christ's chin, a jaw band, and there does seem to be some evidence for this if one looks closely at the shroud image. Dom Albrick concludes the book with a meditation on the shroud as an icon, indeed as the icon, the image of the invisible God, the manifestation of his glorious radiance. The most important things about Face to Face, and also David Socks's file on the shroud, are the expert knowledge and the restraint of the contributors from wild and over-exuberant theorizing. One must always be on one's guard against accepting opinions too readily as facts. Once hypotheses harden, it is often very difficult to admit other evidence that does not fit neatly into one's theory. The October 1978 newsletter of the Academy of Religion and Psychical Research in the USA ran an article by Frank C. Tribba, in which a survey of many of the sindonological findings was given, leaning rather heavily towards Ian Wilson's book, which has, incidentally, now been issued with revisions as a Penguin paperback. One was a trifle disturbed to discover that Wilson's theoretical history of the shroud, in the guise of the Mandylion, had become there an accepted fact. Wilson puts up an interesting case, but still has a good many criticisms to answer, especially, in my opinion, the Besançon connection. Also, I do feel that whereas the thermonuclear flash of Christ's resurrection may be just what we all want, we have probably not yet completely dispensed with alternative theories. We must wait and see.
You have been listening to Talking Point from the Church's Fellowship for Psychical and Spiritual Studies. To find out more, please visit www.churchesfellowship.co.uk.